So I'm Tom Buller with the Kansas Rural Center. We're doing our monthly views from the field this month, talking about the Kansas legislative session, what's going on, maybe what we hope will go on, things like that. This is being recorded, so if you're watching this later, I guess we can see how things change from the time of our conversation to whenever you're watching it. I'm joined by Paul Johnson, who's Kansas Rural Center's policy analyst and also writes our policy watch for us. And yeah, we're just going to talk a little bit about things we see at the legislative session. Certainly, there's a lot happening on the federal front that we're not going to dive into too deeply now, just given that it's the I guess second full week of session or first week of session here. We'll be seeing what's going on. One thing that I was just perusing before I dove in here was the Rural Health Transformation Grant. So I haven't heard the legislative input on that, but it is something that promises to impact Kansas pretty broadly. So Kansas was awarded $221 million for the Rural Health Transformation projects. And I think most significantly for Kansas Rural Center, the piece of that, aside from, hopefully supporting hospitals that are going to be hard hit by federal Medicaid cuts, is the piece about food is medicine that's in there, and there I believe is money for K-State research, not K-State Research Extension, K-State Extension now, to hire some local food specialists. I think four regional local food specialists is what was originally in the grant. So we'll see how that develops over the next year. And we'll see what if the legislature weighs in on that, or if that happens all at the administrative level. But yeah, Kansas should have a lot of money coming to support rural hospitals to hopefully make up for some of those other cuts at the federal level. But I'm getting distracted here. We're focusing on state legislation this year. We're joined by Paul Johnson, and now I see Zack Pistora from the Kansas Sierra Club has joined us. And we're going to talk a little bit about things that are near and dear to the rural center. And I thought maybe a good place to start with. This week we've seen both the governor's State of the State address, which is her final State of the State address, and also the governor's budget's been released. So I don't know, Paul, if you want to jump in on those two things and have any reflections about the governor's priorities and how they relate to, the policy areas of interest for the Kansas Rural Center.
Well, I think the simplest way to look at it is this governor's budget for fiscal year 2027 that starts July 1st in 2026. Our state fiscal years that our federal fiscal years will start October 1 are, off balance 3 months. But the I mean, it's an incredibly status quo budget. Much of our state budget, $25.5 billion dollars, is a lot. Most of it's on automatic pilot. Most of our spending goes for public schools and human services, from Medicaid to child care to foster care that makes up 85% of our state budget. And there's a funding formula in place for public schools that she funds. A caveat to that comment is that this is the last year of this funding formula, which was approved 5, 6 years ago by the Kansas Supreme Court, that locked the state into spending at a certain level or certain increases. They have a consumer price index built into for cost increases. But after this next year, it's going to have to be rewritten. And I think, coming when they come back with the legislature, new governor and everything in 2027, we'll see how much they rewrite it this year in anticipation for the next years. The other part of public education that is not fully funded that Kansas and all states grapple with is special education costs. And and a real part of that problem is that the federal government, which is statutorily required to fund 40% of the special education costs in Kansas, are barely at 12%. And so Kansas over the last 4, 5, 6 years under Kelly, she's made it a priority, is to keep adding state money to try and rectify that imbalance. Our state statute says that we should be up to 92% of the cost should be funded by the state and federal funds, and we're sitting at 70% today. And the practical impact of that is that they the districts have no choice. They have to provide these special services to disabled and, kids. And so, if they don't get the full funding from the state with the feds, then they take it out of their general funding stream. And so, indirectly it impacts all the kids in that school district, because they have to fund it. Oh, she put a little extra money into some staffing shortages with our waivers for the disabled and the traumatic technology and enabled individuals, and she had to put some extra money into staffing shortages for Osawatomie and Larned, and she has a special emphasis beyond public ed and special education to mental health services. And there's a new state hospital opening in early 2027 in Wichita that will kind of add to the balance between Larned and Osawatomie. Um, I guess the last thing I would say, and probably ought to bring Zack into it at this point, is that she really wants to leave. This is her last year. What she would really like to do is have a substantive discussion and a settlement on how we're really going to afford significant sustainable water programs in Kansas. And we can get a longer discussion about that. Zack, you want to jump in?
Yes, I just would agree with you, Paul, on that. I mean, that's the legacy that Governor Kelly wants to leave is on water. I think the water committee is going to have some ideas. There's a water task force going on that won't have their business complete in the short term. But I think the opportunity is there for some big ideas to go before the water committee. The previous discussions of, surfaced around reorganization of the various divisions of agencies that work on water and consolidating them into an Office of Natural Resources. But as we know, you can shuffle things around, but what we really need is significant policy reform, some funding, and specifically dealing with the impact of agriculture. Irrigated agriculture in the western side of the state, even northern side of the state, to the impacts of water quality from runoff. So I think it'd be great if we could put forth some bold ideas and see where they land. Thank you, Paul.
Well, I guess a follow-up comment. I mean, the governor finally has said that water is as important as roads in Kansas or highways. And Kansas is on its fourth 10-year highway program, starting in '89, which actually was the year that we started our state water plan fund. And and that was funded by some state revenues and municipal water fees and agricultural fees. And that was $25 million on the four highway programs that we've had in Kansas. We spend between $1 to $1.3 billion a year on highways. So 25 million to 1.3 billion. I think there's a disconnect there. Um, what the governor wants to do is set up a 10-year water plan like we have 10-year highway plan. But if we use our highway plans as a template, I mean, highways, they look at all funding sources. They try to incorporate it in. So they calculate, they figure in what we're going to get from the feds. They look at what cities and counties put in to their roads, which they do, and then they come up with a complete picture of how it looks and what they need to fund, etc. That's never been the case for water. I mean, as Tom mentioned, I mean, these federal farm bills of $1 billion to $1.3 billion a year. That goes to about 11,000 of our 55,000 farms that get funded by that $1 billion to basically grow wheat, corn, soybeans, and sorghum on 2.3 million acres of irrigated land out of 22 million harvested cropland acres. And it uses, I don't know, 75, 80% of all the water in Kansas. And that data is never mentioned in our state water plan. It's never mentioned by the Kansas Water Authority. I mean, if we're going to get serious about this, we're going to look at those farm payments for commodities. And secondly, we're going to look at the farm payments to go for three key federal conservation programs that are very real in Kansas. CRP, everybody knows that, retirement, 10 to 15 years. The newest one, which the Rural Center was really involved with, is CSP, Conservation Stewardship Program, which is for working farms. And then EQIP, Environmental Quality Incentives Program, which helps with single conservation plans on a farm. Um, when you add up those three programs in Kansas the last few years, they're $200 million a year. And we have a state water plan fund that barely hit 50 million. So until we gather all the data, put it into one place, and talk seriously about federal policy and state policy and that, we are not going to slow it much at all the decline of the Ogallala. Have I got that right, Zach?
Yeah, well put, Paul. I would say there's a couple of other items. There's a big question about water rights, and there's thousands. I think it's
10,000
closer to over
10,000 water rights
10,000 water rights. Okay,
on
so
5,300 farms that irrigate.
okay, so the question is the water belongs to the people of Kansas, and then we lease out the right to use that water in terms of beneficial uses. Okay. The question is, can we withdraw that allocated beneficial use right? Okay. And that's a big legal question because there's a number of water rights experts and legal analysts that think that those are real property rights. And so, do we have to, do an eminent domain to pay those property right holders for that property we've already designated, or can we condition those leases of those agreements with conservation practices? And so I'm curious if there's an opportunity to have the legislature authorize a legal study or a task force, or put the question to a court to help us understand the opportunity involved. And the reason I say that is I get the sense that there's some that would say, well, why don't we just go ahead and buy back all the water rights and all that? And I have a problem. I have a problem with that because we allocated those rights. Many to farmers are using those rights for private gain. I mean, there's public impact in terms of GDP and jobs or whatever, but I have a hard time when 80% of the state's water, as Paul said, is used by a fraction of the farmers, irrigators, roughly 15% of farmers across Kansas, then, are we paying them again? They're the ones cheating our public water supply for current and future generations for private profit. And then we're going to pay them again to buy back those water rights. Just feels like there's opportunity to do some illegal analysis to see what's possible there. The other element here is irrigators don't pay any fees for irrigation into the state water plan fund. A lot of the irrigation fees are collected at the local level with the groundwater management districts, et cetera. But there could be a way to incentivize a public benefit through conservation, or essentially decentivize increased irrigation by putting a fee on it that goes into the state water plan fund, just like there's a pesticide fee, a stock water fee, et cetera, municipal water fees. So is it time that irrigators that use by and large the water in Kansas have to pay some of those fees? I think that's another question to be asked. And then on those beneficial uses, I think we should be using water for drinking for our communities, potentially again for farming and growing food that actually gets good food, that respects the ecology that the food is grown on. But we're using water for fracking, intentional water contamination in the millions of gallons that we have to dispose of through wastewater injection wells across the state. And so I think, could we increase wastewater injection fees to help raise some revenue for water conservation? That could be an option, but really maybe we should prioritize our beneficial uses of water so that their most important beneficial uses get prioritized. Thank you.
I would add that beyond the fact that the waters of Kansas are owned by the residents, the second, basic tenet in water law is that it's supposed to be used for the most beneficial use in Kansas. And what we haven't been looking at is, does that beneficial use look out over the next couple generations of people who might need the water? A couple of the key players that we're really going to have to follow and align with is Representative Jim Bennix from Scott County, and he and Senator Kenny Titus from Pot County are the co-chairs of this task force that Zack mentioned that the legislature's working on. That's going to have a final report, not this year, but in early 2027. And I was on a program with Senator Titus in October, and he made the statement that he didn't think, and Zack really got at this, are these water rights indeed private property rights? And that's never been fully litigated in Kansas. And so if they are, and most attorneys think they are, a few don't, and I'm no attorney, but I mean, I think we're going to have to find some money to lessen their use or buy them out altogether. A piece of the good news is that our Kansas Geological Survey has some of the better water use data of the 50 states, and that they have the capabilities to look at those 10,000 water rights and really come up with a true value. Because a lot of those water rights have a 10-year life expectancy. Other of the water rights are 40 or 50 or longer. And so somebody has to scale that out. And then the last part of my wish list is that if we had the local food entrepreneurs, we don't have a local food economist at K-State or Commerce or Ag. If we had people who were documenting what other crop choices might these irrigators have out there that would use less water, but potentially gain as much money as corn or beans. And it's all part of a puzzle that we just haven't put all the pieces together for how how we get at this. And I don't know if I'm very optimistic that the Kansas legislature has this kind of vision or longer term perspective to solve this kind of problem.
Yeah, I was gonna kind of push on that a little bit because I do think there was a mega bill maybe 4 years ago or 3 years ago that had some of these features we've talked about here in there. So there was the consolidation of authority into one agency, but also I think there were some very, very nominal usage fees for irrigators. I don't remember what it was.
A, ni-
You
a
know,
nickel per a nickel per 1,000 gallons of irrigated water would get us $6 million into the water plan.
Yeah, so I mean, a nickel per 1,000 gallons sounds small, I guess unless you're irrigating a lot of land, then it becomes a big bill. But yeah, I mean that bill got gutted and none of those provisions made it through. Is there any sense? I mean, I know there's a special task force. The governor's talked about this. Is there a sense that this could be something that would happen this session, or are we looking, after elections, and that's something we need to go find candidates who are interested in water? Anybody have a?
I think it comes after this session. I mean, they're supposed to meet for 90 days. I think at best they're going to be here for 70 days. I think they want to get the hell out of town. They've already set up, the short, we're going to start the veto session the 9th of April, and normally it doesn't start till the last week of April. I and I don't think they have the political courage to really take this on for this session. And I do think that gubernatorial candidates need to be a player in kind of this dialogue at this point. Um, I mean, the reality is that the Farm Bureau and KLA, I mean, they write Kansas agriculture law, and then they run it through the Department of Ag. And there's virtually no other groups. Farmers Union tries, but there really aren't other voices up there that speak to agriculture. And so, where I do think there's going to be a counterbalancing forces are cities like Hayes and Russell, and I think Garden City and Dodge, and places that are really starting to tune in to what their water system may very well be. And I think, that's going to be, and I think Johnson County and, the, what Zack talked about, unless we change farming patterns, we're going to continue to put soil into our reservoirs at an unsustainable level. And two-thirds of Kansans have their public water storage in about five, six, eight federal reservoirs. And until I mean, that there are other forces that have to come into play to shape this debate.
If if I may, on the sedimentation of the reservoirs, and that's been getting some early attention in the House Water Committee because of the hydraulic injection dredging project in, or maybe it's hydrological dredging project there in Tuttle Creek Reservoir. Okay, and so think about the way you can blow into a straw to stir up the bottom of your cup, sort of thing, and then the sediment would flow up from the bottom of the reservoir downstream into essentially the Kansas River and all that. So they've done I think two tests right now. I think there maybe is another one, or maybe they just completed
Maybe
their
one in
first
the
test.
spring.
Okay. So, the question is, well, are there downstream consequences and all that? Is they're actually getting enough sedimentation to get out of the reservoir and all that? Okay, but putting that aside a little bit, one
longstanding policy approach, or actually it's been a practice more than it's been a policy, is the opportunity for riparian buffer strips, to allow for, in high rain events, the sediment to not run off the fields, or the fertilizers or pesticides and the liquids to not run off the fields, but rather get trapped by a riparian buffer area, grasslands and trees that can absorb, keep the soil in place, absorb any nutrients and all that before it gets into our water bodies. Well, there are some examples up in Minnesota of requiring farmers to have a 30-foot buffer strip between it and a waterway. And that's something that the Kansas Forest Service has long said that is one of the cheapest and most productive ways to impact water and stream bank stabilization efforts and all that in a natural way. And so I think we could offer that as not only a smart approach, a relatively low cost approach, but something we would need the farm community to buy into, that we should allow a 30-foot buffer between, and not farm all the way to the bank. So that's something we maybe can get behind on that policy approach. Certainly would help sedimentation, but also help with agricultural runoff as well, and nutrient overloading.
Well, if we had this complete picture of both our federal, state, funding for water programs, what we would see is that obviously the commodity crops get, fully funded. CRP is close to maxing out, but it pretty much is an entitlement, so it gets its funding. The other two, CSP and EQIP, are CRP is run by FSA, whereas the other two are out of Natural Resources Conservation Service, and those are budget limited. So last year, Kansas had a number of farmers who wanted to do a CSP and a whole farm conservation plan, which could include buffer strips and cover crops and, a range of activities. But we only had the federal funding at that point for 25% of those who were eligible to get the funding. And it's the same way with EQIP. And I think the question for our state water plan is, besides dealing with water rights and what we're going to spend on those, is if we looked at our key watersheds above Tuttle, above Perry, above Redmond, above Milford, which are really, we should look and understand, are there farmers up there who wanted to do this and couldn't get funded? And should we fund that with state money through the state water plan? I have a lot of dreams, about how things ought to go with this legislature, but uh, we should
Yeah.
have
Visionary, visionary, Paul.
well, I don't
Go
know
ahead,
about
Tom.
that.
Yeah, I
Tilting
was
a
just
lot
gonna
of windmills, but
I was gonna say that kind of treads really close to what I would say is the rural center's big priority for this legislative session is the House Bill 2063, which is the Kansans for Conservation bill, that's been introduced. Now, I feel like, when we start talking about federal farm bill money, the money that House Bill 2063 would be putting into conservation, so this would be state dollars going into a conservation fund, half of which would be used for working lands, and the other half would be used for wildlife parks, tourism, those sorts of other beneficial conservation practices. That's something we don't see. Kansas is one of, I don't remember, 13 states, 11 states maybe, that don't have that kind of dedicated conservation funding. But that is something that's coming up this session. Hopefully, we'll see some movement this year, some positive movement on that, for the state to do that. But yeah, I think that's going into conservation broadly, and I think what you're talking about, Paul, is really focused on specific practices that would be beneficial for water. And I do think, yeah, getting some of those state water plan fund dollars focused on that could be really beneficial. I know, yeah, a lot of other states, Iowa has a lot of water quality issues, and they've had some success with, implementing those kind of buffers on in some areas. It definitely could be more widespread. So that's something of interest, I think.
I think it would be a real draw for the hunter organizations and sportsmen, and giving more of an environment for broader fowl and game stock out there.
So, Zach, I was curious. You mentioned Minnesota having these buffer strips that are they required along stream banks of a certain order stream, or is that something? I mean, right now what we see is there's conservation dollars that can go to that. Obviously those are limited dollars, but we don't. I guess we're driving conservation policy with kind of the carrot rather than the stick here in Kansas. Is that something where those are required in other states?
Yeah, I believe so. I thought I just read an article about this recently, and I'll have to pull it up. But it was initially, I think it was, I want to say 2017 or 2018, something like that, where Minnesota, their we're thinking, of course, that landed 10,000 lakes up there. They want to preserve their water resources. But initially it was, I think there was some sort of financial incentive program, but ultimately, I believe it is a law that mandates that up to 50 feet on lakes, streams, etc., to have a riparian buffer strip. Now, I think there was initial some nervousness from the agriculture community about having laws and requirements placed upon them, displacement of farmland, some of those things. But I think they've come around and understand the benefit of these things, both the wildlife and habitat, but also to the water quality. So I think there's been some changes where, in some places it doesn't make sense to maybe have a buffer strip of certain places along roadside ditches and all that, where there might be some ephemeral streams, etc. But that's something I would point to as far as opportunity for us. That conservation funding bill you just mentioned, Tom, I think it's great. It'd be a great start for us. If you listen to the state of the state from the governor's standpoint, water is her legacy. She wants to get this legislature to finally do something about it. If you listen to the Republican counter message there was also some agreement that a lot of the progress on water was made by the House Water Committee, led by Republicans, etc. But there was a point about core services and how we don't want to inflate government programs and that get in the way, that add dollars to the budget, etc. So if we're going to support and legislators are going to support conservation funding, we need to kind of frame that push in terms of core government services. And, I think back to the pandemic when, there wasn't a lot people could do because things were shut down, but people did want to go outside. People were going to our parks for recreation and enjoyment. So I think that there's an element of core services ingrained with protecting our lands, having access to nature, and all that. So anyway, for what that's worth.
Yeah, I think that's a helpful point because, Paul mentioned earlier the governor's budget, excuse me. But last year, I think, was the first year the legislature tried to, really grab the reins of the budgeting process. And from what I've heard, they're very interested in continuing to cut spending this session, in the short session. So thinking about how to frame something like that is asking for new spending is really critical.
Tom, can I raise one other water issue?
Absolutely.
Um, Actually, it has to do with Hayes and Russell and their battle over moving water from Edwards County K9 Ranch, about it's either 70 or 90 miles down to Russell and Hayes. They bought that ranch in the late 1990s. And they've been in court for 25 years trying to battle it. They got it through most of the district courts and they got, their way on it, and then once the legal issues are over, it falls to a certain three-person panel at the state level that makes kind of a final decision on this water use. And that panel has the chief engineer from Ag and the director of the Kansas Water Office and the head of the Division of Environment at KDH&E. And they eventually ruled for it. And then ranchers and people in Edwards County put together a pack and brought a case about 2.5 weeks ago before the Kansas Supreme Court and argued that, and I guess I say all this because I think that it's possible out of this ruling that we may get more clarity on what water law is in Kansas, and that then they may just dismiss it because they don't think these ranchers have proper standing. But and when you move for basics here, when you move water from an agricultural use to manufacturing or commercial or municipal use, then your water right is diminished by something like a third at least. So you're getting less water, but for other purposes. And so we'll see if this is the final battle and whether Hayes and Russell will finally be able to complete this pipeline. Is that your reading, Zach?
Yeah, I think that's about right, Paul. We'll see how that goes. Again, that begs the question, what's the most important beneficial use at that point?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Yeah, that has been going on for quite a while with Hayes and Russell trying to settle that issue. So
Well,
hopefully
we
this
had a
provides some
state law
clarity.
for a long time that said if you moved water over 35 miles, that it was prohibited. And so they had that. And hell, I remember the lobbyists for the city of Hayes coming up to the legislature in the mid late 90s trying to get that statute changed. Um, his name was Hannes Zacharias, who then went on to become the county manager in Johnson County after Hayes from Dodge City and wrote a book on navigating the Arkansas River, first in 1976 and then in 1996. And he wrote a book about the memoirs of what happened to my river.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could still navigate it in 1996 or if it was
He
hiking.
walked a lot of it too.
Yeah. Zach, one question I wanted to send your way. I know you had mentioned earlier in a conversation about an energy bill that was coming up. Do you have comments on that? More information?
Yeah, so thank you, Tom. I had a couple other side issues, this energy discussion, and then also I got a call yesterday about a pesticide regulation bill that I thought would be appropriate for this group. On energy, there's some lobbyists and stakeholders trying to work on a kind of overhaul of a number of questions in the energy space, including the opportunity for lease agreements for third parties to allow for companies and churches and nonprofits and even big businesses to allow for arrangement for a power purchase agreement outside of the utility. Right now, you have to go through the utility and be connected in the grid for a lot of these arrangement for like a solar farm, if you will. This would allow a bill would allow for third parties to kind of come up with those financial arrangements independently of the utility to allow the transfer of energy to go through them. Still maintained by the electrical grid from the utility, but just a financial arrangement for a leasing system for that power. So that's good. There's also interesting provisions in this energy mega bill that would provide for the Citizens Utilities Ratepayer Board that protects small businesses and consumer interests to have more of a say at the Southwest Power Pool, which is kind of our regional power grid that Kansas is a part of, giving them more at stake to participate in those proceedings down there as a state quasi state energy association to represent consumers, residential customers at that regional power level. That's not necessarily too bad. There's also some things about whether the board of the Citizens Utility Ratepayers Board should be more balanced in terms of political affiliation. So you couldn't have more than a simple majority of one party on the board that would be kind of balanced. Right now, there is no such provisions. The governor can basically appoint anyone to the CURB board as their terms expire. So there's that. But then there's some other things that kind of signal some interest in getting the Kansas out of the Southwest Power Pool, which I would be hesitant to support because the Southwest Power Pool, because of the regional nature of it, when there's cheaper resources that are available within our region, then Kansas can benefit from that. And so there's a day ahead bidding market for the energy you need the next day based on forecasts. And it's saved our state and the region a bunch of money by pooling together the resources, literally. So, and Kansas has benefited because we sell a lot of the power to the other states in the region because of the low cost wind resource that we have. So it's a mixed bag. It's also this energy mega bill would kind of give a little bit more expedite the opportunity for like nuclear power in Kansas. Depending on how you feel about that, I think it's like one of the most expensive forms of energy generation there is. A lot of it's untested. And so Kansas has seen two prospective nuclear projects, one that would be a mile underground, which would save costs and potentially reduce the risk and security concern there. I think they're eyeing Parsons, Kansas. I think they've actually broke ground there in that project. But another project would be more of these small modular advanced nuclear reactors that use less water and use kind of molten salt as a medium for transferring the heat and the nuclear process there. Long story short, there's a lot of opportunities, tried and true, cheaper, more direct benefit to the local community with solar energy, battery storage, and even potentially more wind projects in Kansas than going to the nuclear option. Leslie, thank you for your comment there, the broken ground in Parsons. And from what I gather, the Parsons community hasn't got a chance to weigh in on that. There's kind of some of the leaders and some of the opportunity from the federal government, since they got the main nuclear regulatory agency there to go ahead and greenlight that project. You want to say anything about that, Leslie?
I don't know a whole lot about it, but I do know that the community was not a part of it at all. It kind of just happened one day, like, boom, exciting news, here's what's going on, and nobody knew that it was going to happen. And then they announced it, and then they broke ground like within a very short period of time. And there are a lot of people very unhappy about that.
Yeah.
So,
Well, it would be the first of its kind in the country, and as would be the second one that Zach was talking about, because we don't have a commercial small nuclear reactor that's up and running in this country. And the other thing that's happening is the Trump administration is just completely dismantling the Nuclear Regulatory Commission at the federal level that would be the safeguard that would be asking some of the right questions about safety at this point. And so, boy, I think we ought to I agree 100% with Zach about the fact that, the first dollar we need to spend in Kansas is to insulate our homes and replace our old
Right.
motors and, you know, energy conservation, which we're virtually dead last of the 50 states.
Right. So that's all I know. We should have some bill language to look at here pretty soon. I've heard it called the True Act, transparency and something utility, so we'll see what the acronym actually stands for. But yeah, I get the sense that it's a mixed bag, and it would be good for us to highlight what we think might be a beneficial opportunities that might have more direct impact for what Kansas is, our communities that we live in, et cetera. So stay tuned.
Hey, Tom, could I go back to your very opening comments about that grant on the health
Sure.
care and,
I,
what Kansas was facing at this point?
yeah, I
Uh,
do want to make sure we get time for Zach to talk about pesticides, but if you want to go with that, Paul, and then we'll go back to
Well,
pesticides.
I mean, the overall picture is we have a $25.5 billion state budget. 10.5 billion of that is state general fund, income and sales tax. Then the other of the 15 left, half of it's federal and half of it's other fees. So we have a $10 billion state general fund. We have now put together $2 billion in a special rainy day fund, budget stabilization fund that's outside. And I think at some point the question is, when does it start raining in Kansas? We could talk about it in terms of SNAP and what's going to happen to a lot of those people and work requirements, etc. But on the health side, we saw the ending of those additional benefits for the Affordable Act, Obamacare. That impacts 160,000 Kansans, which is about 7% of our population. The other thing is, with the Medicaid cuts that are coming, Kansas has 100 rural hospitals. We're second only to Texas. 68 of those 100 are in financial straits, and 30 are on death's door. And if we don't see some supplemental money from that rainy day fund or something out of Kansas, I mean, I think we could watch a collapse of key medical facilities in our state.
So I guess on that, I mean, I'm not an expert on healthcare. I don't know, what that looks like. I know we've had a number of hospitals that have closed over the past few years. Yeah, I guess that is a question. At what point do folks decide it's raining now and start going for that rainy day fund?
Well,
Um,
a few states have stepped up and used state funding to help fill in some of that gap on those subsidies for the Affordable Care Act. So that would be part of it. Um, I mean, that $221 million is not, I mean, I don't know if I have a number off the exact top of my head, but we're probably talking $5 or $6 billion for can care in
mhm.
Kansas. And so, it's not going to save rural hospitals. And, the Kansas Hospital Association says, well, a lot of these rural hospitals are funded by property tax, and people, absolutely want their health care, so they'll just pony up more property tax for it. I don't know if I want to poll on that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's something definitely to keep in mind and pay attention to. Thanks for raising that, Paul. Um, do you want to comment on pesticides? We're coming here now towards the bottom of the
Yeah,
hour.
if you don't mind, just real quick, so I got a call from a legislator last night that said that there's some interest by the Agrochemical Retailers Association, or one of the agriculture outfits in the state, along with, I think, a group um, off the East Coast that might come in and say that we don't need any state regulation on pesticides because it's regulated by the federal government, the EPA. Follow the label. And if it's on the label, then potentially we don't need any state regulation, and or we don't shouldn't allow for consumers to sue those companies responsible for those pesticides as long as it's consistent with the label. Okay, so I don't have bill text yet. I don't know for sure if that's totally what the bill would provide for, but the sense was we don't need state regulation if we have federal regulation. And we know there's not a whole lot of federal regulation right now. But the other argument is when people get affected by spray drift or contamination from pesticides, who do they call? They call the state. The Department of Agriculture has a pesticide program and a hotline that you could call if you're impacted by spray drift. And we know that in our community here with the Kansas Rural Center, with specialty crop growers, et cetera, organics, et cetera, that spray drift is all too common. And so I think it would be important for us to show up and say, not only do we need state regulations, and well, we probably should improve them given the lack of follow through or justice that these people often see when they get impacted, they lose their crops, and all that's being affected. So, more to come on that. I think it would be opportunity for us to reach out to maybe some of those people that have asked us for help in the past that have been affected. I'd like to do an information request from Department of Agriculture to see how many hundreds of Kansans call them to make a complaint about contamination and spray drift. Well, we worked together to with legislators a few years back about a bipartisan effort to help reduce spray drift. You might remember the dicamba problems a few years back. I'm sure it's not gone away. So anyway, just something to be thinking about. That was just kind of news to me. So stay tuned.
Yeah, that is, I know that's an issue at the federal level too. There's been some, discussion about, I think really the issue is on the label. Glyphosate specifically doesn't have a cancer warning. And I think Roger McCullen did some good write-ups on that. And from what I understand, there have been a variety of lawsuits, and the different federal districts and maybe the courts of appeals in those different regions, it's kind of split right now as to whether, not having that cancer warning on the label means that the manufacturer has no liability for any cancer claims, or if they still have that liability. So I know that there are other states that are looking at that kind of preemption so that people can't sue. And I know there's also, action at the federal level. I think Representative Thompson, who's the chair of the House Ag Committees, talked about some of those, trying to pass some of that preemption at the federal level. But yeah, there's some big money behind some of that, because Bayer specifically is seeing,
Right.
multiple billion-dollar lawsuits. So they really have an interest in trying to limit their liability. Um,
Right.
yeah, but yeah, thanks for raising that. We'll keep our eyes on
Yeah, and I would guess that Bayer was behind a bill in Georgia that got passed about removing liability and some of that. So I expect that this could be that. So that was just passed in Georgia recently. So um,
They tried to
anyway,
push they tried to push that legislation in Missouri, and people rebounded and were able to stop it from since Bayer bought Monsanto, which is
it.
based in Missouri, and so um, people were able to react to that.
Yeah, we'll definitely keep our eyes out. Thanks for the heads up on that, Zach. Just a few minutes left here. Paul or Zach, any closing thoughts, things that you wanted to talk about that you haven't had a chance to?
it's been a good discussion. Thank you all.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I agree. Thank you.
yeah. Thanks for joining us. You have a question or comment, Jackie?
Video or
You're
audio.
muted. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Just what I put in the chat there about the conservation districts. It's kind of old news, but it's a big win for, that local level. And in the article I have here on it, it is, water quality and quantity is definitely mentioned. And Marcy Francisco says, helping farmers understand the advantages of conservation practices such as cover crops could in turn have a significant impact on both soil. So way back to the sediment issue, I guess is
Yeah.
where I was going with that. So
Yeah,
a
and that was
win.
the big win for conservation last session, I think, was that doubling of the state commitment to support those conservation districts. So it used to be a dollar for dollar match up to $25,000 with the local county commitment, and now it's two for
Two
one. So
dollars. Yeah.
if the county commits 25,000, then the state will match 50. So yeah, that is good. Getting some additional conservation dollars and that technical support that's very locally based is great. So, all right. Well,
Thanks for bringing that up. That is
yeah,
important.
Yeah,
good to celebrate those wins when we get them.
for sure.
Well, thanks so much, Paul and Zach, for joining us and providing some insight. Looking forward to being in touch throughout the session, and hope things are going well for everybody, and have a good afternoon. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye. Thank
Thank
you.
you.